Here's a rule of thumb for understanding Washington politics. On the rare occasion when everything, including the kitchen sink, gets thrown at a cabinet nominee to block his or her appointment, there's a solid chance that the opposition is not merely about the negative headlines that you're hearing about. Instead, it's more likely that the opposition is motivated by a deeper belief that the nominee somehow fundamentally threatens the Beltway's permanent power structure. That's particularly the case when a nominee is seen as a threat to the lucrative business of permanent war. This is a good way to understand what's almost certainly fueling much of the opposition in the Congress right now to the nomination of former Republican Senator Chuck Hagel as the next Secretary of Defense. At first glance, much of that opposition may seem bewildering, confusing. Why would Republican senators so adamantly oppose one of their own to head the Pentagon? Why would a Republican House member, for instance, go even further and insist there were more qualified Democrats for President Obama to nominate? In a political system where extreme rhetoric and policy positions are now totally mundane, it's possible that some believe all that nonsense, all that criticism. However, just as likely is the possibility that many of these critics are making such over-the-top charges, knowing full well that Chuck Hagel's nomination has a better than average chance of being defeated, not because any of the issues in the headlines about his position on Israel or his position on this or that policy, but because of what position he is perceived to hold about defense spending. Specifically, at the very moment that defense industry lobbyists are in a full-on panic about relatively mild cuts to the Pentagon budget, Hagel is viewed by the defense-coddling Washington establishment as a threat to defense spending, thanks to two previously little-noticed comments he made in 2011. In an interview that year with the Financial Times about a defense budget that is now bigger than most of the rest of the world's combined, Hagel dared to say that that budget, quote, has been bloated and needs to be pared down. In a separate speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, he went further saying the defense budget, quote, is not a jobs program. It's not an economic development program for my state or any district. These statements track recent public opinion polling data showing far more Americans believe, like Hagel, that we spend too much on the military rather than too little. Yet Hagel's comments are considered radical in a Washington where the same Republican senators who decry the deficit also cite the prospect of any defense spending cuts as a big reason to avoid a long-term bipartisan budget deal. This is why, if you listen closely, you can hear defense spending as a common theme bubbling beneath much of the diffuse noise against Hagel's nomination. Republican senators keep mentioning his supposed support for cuts that they say would weaken America's national security. Of course, the very notion of Hagel as a Pentagon budget cutter is kind of silly, but it's revealingly silly. A quick look at his voting record in the Senate over the last 10 years shows a lawmaker who reliably supported nearly every Pentagon spending bill before the U.S. Senate. That voting record, in fact, is probably why so many of his Senate staffers were able to land jobs after their time in government as defense industry lobbyists. So what's revealing about the effort to now portray Chuck Hagel as a dangerous Pentagon penny pincher is what that effort says about the larger discussion of military spending in Washington. It says that the discourse is so dominated by the assumption that military spending must increase that a senator with Hagel's voting record is somehow portrayed as a radical. Why? Because despite his lockstep voting record for bigger and bigger defense budgets, he once committed the crime of publicly admitting that there is waste in that budget, and he agrees with most Americans that the defense budget is not too small. The truth is, the kind of defense secretary who should scare us is one who doesn't believe the Pentagon budget is too big. After all, none other than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff recently declared that debt, much of it created by Pentagon spending, is the single biggest threat to America's national security. In light of all this, then, there should be no doubt that Hagel's opposition to the Iraq War, his refusal to back a preemptive war against Iran, and his less hawkish rhetoric than fellow Republican senators, all that is viewed by his opponents not merely as a foreign policy disagreement, but also as a defense spending problem. If new wars and occupations are major profit opportunities for defense contractors, Hagel is seen as a special threat because he seems interested in reducing Pentagon spending, and he also isn't interested in, let's say, emergency war appropriations. To power brokers in Washington, that warrants a scorched earth opposition campaign against his nomination. Knowing his war medals insulate him from being slandered as an America-hating terrorist appeaser, that power structure is settled on stopping his nomination before he is ever permitted to reclaim a national platform.